Our final speaker for the day to talk to us on Fearless in Flow is none other than Emile Raubenheimer, the CEO of Pop-Up, which stands for People Upliftment Program. It has a holistic approach to the upliftment of underprivileged communities in South Africa. Emile further helps companies and individuals to identify their potential. He has a passion for social impact through conscientious. Nanto, conscientious. I'm joking. Through Catholic interventions to create sustainable change. Can we put our hands together for Emile?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. It's an absolute privilege to spend time with you today. I know it's been a super long day, and I realize the applauses are actually because you're nearing the end, so I'll try to not take too much time. I realize my brief is technically to speak about Fearless in Flow, and I've titled my discussion with you, Embracing Fear. Now that sounds a little bit counterintuitive because I thought we were trying to get away from fear, but in my preparation I've actually discovered something incredible. Fear is powerful. And I want to show you today with my presentation why it is so powerful, and if we could get it right to harness fear effectively, what would change in the way that we show up into spaces. Because fear, believe it or not, is part of our design. And we cannot be integrated whole people if we try to be fearless. Because that means there is a portion of our inherent design that we are trying to discount. The question is, what is the purpose of this portion of our design, and how do we harness that towards God's purposes with our lives? So I want to introduce a picture, and when you see this picture, what I want you to consider is, let me tell you a story perhaps. Let's say you were a sailor way back when they had really small, rickety wooden boats. The ocean was unexplored and like a daunting place because the earth had not yet been mapped. Can you put yourself in that position? And you go out on this little trip and you get confronted with something in the middle of the ocean that you have never seen before. You don't have a scientific dissertation and a scientific name for the thing that you are being confronted with. All you see are these radical arms that look like jelly that are protruding out of the ocean and grabbing hold of your boat. Can you imagine that? You have no language for this thing that you are being confronted with. And so something really fascinating happens. This is a mythology. I hope you can see the picture well. And you see those tentacles that are growing over the boat. So the first time that you encounter something like this, you have no language for it because the species hasn't been mapped yet. And so the question is, what does our mind do when it tries to explain what is going on? What does it do? You see, it triggers a fear response, and something in us says, this thing that is unexplainable, I have no language for, and therefore it is so threatening to me that it must be a bigger deal than it actually is. Are you with me? And so our entire mythology comes from fear. So much of the creatures, so much of the stories that our ancestors told themselves in order to make sense of things that they are encountering that they do not understand. It makes that thing bigger, scarier, more imposing than it actually is. If you don't believe me, then just go look at any scary space movie, right? The unexplored, the unknown, we tend to blow it up because it scares us. And so understanding the mythology of fear, understanding where generally our experiences come from becomes so critical and so important because it's illogical. Are you with me? A lot of the way that fear makes sense of the world is not a logical response. There is a fascinating book written by Jordan Peterson. He is a psychologist in Canada. He's really well known. He wrote a couple of books. One of them in particular is called Maps of Meaning. So he writes actually about how we deal with fear, and he says something fascinating. He says, there is an effective significance of the unknown. That which we neither value or understand is magnified by our imagination. Our fear makes what we encounter appear larger, more monstrous than it really is. The myths we create embody this exaggerated experience of the unknown, portraying it as something that must be confronted and conquered, often in the form of dragons, giants, and malevolent forces. This is the way that we are designed to function when we encounter something that we do not know or cannot understand. And that gift was given to us for a particular reason. So I want you to put yourself in this picture. Imagine you are standing there on a safari and you see this happening. What is going to happen to your body? Do you guys know? Are you going to be fearless? Probably not. Is it possible to be fearless in this situation? Yes. Have you seen trained guards, trained nature conservationists that walk with a gun when they take you and a lion or an elephant is storming them? Have you seen what they do? They approach the animal and they make themselves larger. They become the threat, isn't it so? Why are they not afraid in this situation? Because it's not new to them. It's not unknown to them. They understand the dynamics of what is happening. Are you with me? Fear is there in particular to help us navigate situations that we have too little information about. This is very important, and I'm going to bring that back. So, there's a fascinating physiology that happens. There's something in your brain called the amygdala. It's the size of an almond. And when you are confronted with lions charging, that thing goes into overdrive. It freaks out. And it sends messages to the brain to say, you need to quickly pump some hormones into this body so that it can save itself. Do you know which two hormones it pumps into the body? Adrenaline and cortisol. Those two things are very important because when you're confronted with this situation, let me tell you, unless you are a conservationist who knows how to deal with this, you want adrenaline and cortisol. That is a good thing. Okay, so let's talk about why. Cortisol increases blood sugar levels so that there is more energy available, and it suppresses non-essential bodily functions like digestion and immune response, because honestly, you don't care about bacteria when this thing is happening. Okay, so the body is reallocating resources. It needs cortisol to do that, and that is triggered by fear. This is a good thing. The second thing that happens is adrenaline. Adrenaline raises the heart rate, increases blood flow to the muscles because they are the things that need the blood, and it dilates the pupils and it sharpens your cognitive focus. So when you are confronted with this situation, do you want your body to have a fear response? Yes, you do. It is a survival mechanism, right? You probably shouldn't run. So let's just put that out there. You probably shouldn't be running unless there is, I don't even know, you can't even climb a tree to get away. I should have used the hippo. Okay, so the point is that our physiology is designed to have fear responses. There is nothing you can do to not have that. So it is impossible to be fearless, because it is a physiological response. Are you with me? The question is, when we are confronted with fear and all of these things start happening in our body, what are we doing with that? And can we learn to harness that better? And this is the question. The challenge, though, is how many of you recently have been confronted with a life-threatening disaster? Something like a lion attacking you in the street. How many of you have had to run for your life recently? Not many. Do you understand the problem? Our physiology is very well adapted to surviving in harsh environments where our survival is under threat. But the majority of the threats, and therefore the fears that we are confronted with today, are not physical. They're psychological. And this changes the ballgame a little bit. Because what we need to appreciate is that when the fear is psychological, the body lets us down a little bit. So do we have psychological fears that trigger exactly the same response? Yes, we do. The challenge is, in today's modern world, those fear responses happen incredibly frequently. And so we have language for this. We don't call it fear anymore. Do you guys know what we call it? We call it stress. Stress is exactly the same thing as fear because the response is the same in the brain. It still triggers the brain to release cortisol and adrenaline. The challenge is, do I have to now run away from something? No, I don't need to run. And the challenge is also that this is not an immediate imposing threat. This is a constant low-level threat. And so my body is constantly confronted with cortisol and adrenaline, cortisol and adrenaline, cortisol and adrenaline, because I am overwhelmed by the psychological fears that I'm confronted with on a daily basis. There are 5 of them that I want to highlight today. For the psychologists in the room, there are probably more, but I think for the purposes of today's conversation, this will do. And I am just going to give you pictures, otherwise you're going to read a million different slides. So, these are the 5 responses, or the 5 fears that we have. Let's start with this one in the bottom. I'll take them one at a time, right? How many of you watch soccer? At least 3 people. Wonderful. Okay, so there's actually a saying, you're on the spot. Have you heard that saying? Do you know where it comes from? I don't know, but I think it's from soccer. So there's a little dot here that's called the penalty spot. And when you have to take a penalty like this guy here, the whole stadium is looking at what you are going to do when you reach that spot. Does that make sense when you're on the spot? A lot of eyes are on you. You have to do something. It's all up to you. So this person, when he is standing there ready to take the kick, what kind of fear is he experiencing? Fear of failure, right? We often get confronted with this. We have the constant pressure to say, what happens if I fail? How much is riding on this thing? And so that's just a good example. This little ducky here is the only red ducky facing the wrong way. We have a very big fear of exclusion and isolation. It's a social thing. We want to be part of social groups. It's part of our design. We are relational creatures. And so being separated from relationship is a really big fear driver for us. I don't know if you can see that image clearly. It's a guy standing in front of a really big cave. Do you guys want to take a guess what fear that is? Fear of the unknown. And so that's something that we get confronted with often because the world is so ambiguous, it's so volatile, it's so complex that it is incredibly difficult to see far into the future, particularly in our finances as well. And so when we get confronted with the future can very often become an unknown and therefore be a driver of fear in our life. That's probably the best picture I could find. It's a vacuum sucking up money. But it's basically the fear of loss, right? This is not just financial. This could be relational, this could be status, but all of it is a fear of you losing something that is important to you, whether to your identity, whether to your social functioning, or whether to your ability to respond to the pressures of life. And then finally, that's a whole bunch of medical stuff. We have a fear of mortality. We do not want to die. If you don't believe me, I don't know how many of you went through COVID, all of you. All of a sudden, everybody had a fear of death, isn't it so? Especially in those first couple of months, because we did not understand the thing. And so the thing became incredibly big, incredibly quickly, because it was the first time we were confronted with it. Are you with me? So we've seen this in modern times, and we see that all of these fears are frequent. And if we have a stress response to this, even if it is a low-level stress response, your brain is still telling your hypothalamus to release cortisol and adrenaline. And that has a whole bunch of consequences because we can't sustain those high levels of cortisol and adrenaline in our bodies. They're very, very unhealthy. They affect our diet, they affect our mood, they affect our cravings for sugar, they affect everything. Even our cognitive functioning is affected by these constant low levels of cortisol and adrenaline. That's not what fear was meant to do. And so let's bring it into the realm of finance, because I'm actually here to talk about fearless in flow, right? So how does this translate into the world of finance? There's a brilliant guy called Daniel Kahneman. I believe he's actually a Nobel Prize winner in psychology. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he said that there are predominantly two kind of ways that we solve problems in our brain. The one is fast thinking, and it's kind of the one that we prefer, right? You don't have to do a lot of analysis. You look at something and you're like, yes, this is the answer. This is an incredibly powerful decision-making mechanism that we have been given, part of our design, right? So there's a really big stag here that's looking sort of aggressive or maybe just disinterested. I don't know, because I don't work with reindeer often. But the question is, if you see that, so if you walk around a corner in a bush and you're confronted with that, the decision you make around how you're going to treat that situation, that is the system 1 response. Because you have to make a decision very quickly. So the way we read body language is a system 1 response. The way that we answer riddles is a system 1 response. The way that we pick random numbers is a system 1 response. Are you with me? Okay, so system 1 functions on heuristics. What heuristic mean effectively are just thinking patterns. Models that we have that we use to interpret reality, and when something happens, we just pull the file and we execute the model. Does that make sense? The challenge is that sometimes those models are wrong. Because be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. Renewing, constant process. And then you will see the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So if we're not renewing the mind, if we're not changing the models, then when we have to do the lazy thinking and the quick thinking, we use the broken model. What is system 1 incredibly bad at? It's incredibly bad at statistics. It's incredibly bad at complex decision making. It's incredibly bad at planning. It's incredibly bad at thinking about the future. So the question is, when you make your financial decisions, which system are you using? And this is the crisis we come to, because when we are trained actually to live with low levels of fear, we get really, really lazy. We don't want to analyze stuff. We don't want to sit with stuff. The reason we don't want to sit with those stuff is because by sitting with them, we elicit fear. If you are under financial pressure, do you want to spend the end of the month and say, let's do a budget? No, because you don't want the answer. It will be a fearful thing for you. It will create anxiety and uncertainty. And so you say, no, fake Satan, I do not want to touch the budget. Isn't it so? How many of you have testaments? No, you don't do testamentary planning because you don't want to think about your death. Because mortality is a primary driver of fear in your life. And so you say, I will not do a testament. I will delay it as long as possible until I am dead and make it somebody else's problem. Are you with me? And so these psychological fears that we are confronted with, we design into the way that we live life because we do not want to sit and think and analyze our fears because they are fears. And they elicit a response in our brain and in our chemistry that we don't like. The challenge is that how it's supposed to be? Because right now I'm pretty sure if I ask you, do you think fear is a gift? Well, unless you've run away from a lion recently, probably your answer is no, right? Okay, so right now it's incredibly difficult for us to see fear as a gift. But I think we have a challenge with how we understand God's intent with fear. Because we have scriptures about fear, don't we? We have many scriptures about fear, and the scripture actually kind of informs the frameworks through which we see fear. So if you think about the conversation we had at the beginning about the mythology, when we get confronted with something we do not understand, I want to pose to you that I think we engage with fear in exactly the same way. It's something we do not understand, and so we make it bigger and worse than it actually is. And if we're willing to engage this thing that scares us, which is fear itself, we will be able to get a more mature response. But then we need to be willing to say, let me learn about this thing. And that's why I'm telling you, let us embrace fear today. Let us learn what this thing is, because when we understand it, we see, number one, the monster is not so big beneath the water. And number two, it's actually incredibly valuable. Alrighty. So, what happens when system one fails? Because it does. It fails often. So Jordan Peterson has this quote. The individual confronted by chaos must act or retreat. Right? Fight or flight. You must do one of the two, maybe freeze, depending on how serious you are about the psychology stuff. So, into fear, must act or must retreat into fear and paralysis. Action requires the adoption of and the willingness to and Does that sound like system 2? Does that sound like work? Yes, because we have to take responsibility, which means we must press into the thing that scares us. Because it scares us because we do not understand it. Are you with me? And so, how many of you have heard in Kingdom we talk about we have to be countercultural? Because fear expects us to run away. But what we should be doing is pressing into it. Because it is in fact a gift. And so when system 1 fails, when it helps us, when we make wrong decisions because we're functioning on impulses, and perhaps our impulses, the mapping network isn't accurate or useful, then we can't use system 1, which means we have to slow things down, way down. And now the challenge is if we are constantly under adrenal and cortisol fatigue, and we are used to living our life from a kind of baseline level of fear that's just always there, uncertainty or rejection or the unknown or the future or death itself, then I deprioritize doing the work because I've become accustomed to the baseline level. So given the choice, I would say, do you want to just sustain the baseline? Or do you want to, for a period of time, go into a higher status of fear, which we obviously don't want, because that will reduce the baseline after? What are you probably going to choose? You're going to choose to sustain it because you have a fear for the unknown. And so you will stick with the devil you know. Although it is a very bad devil, you will stick with it because you do not want to increase the unknown in your life. And so fear traps us. Are you with me? Is it possible, perhaps, that the Bible has something to say about this? You might not believe me if I tell you it does. It specifically addresses this exact thing. There are 2 words for fear that I want to talk to you in the Greek about. But the first one, I want to tell you where it comes from. Hebrews 2, verse 14 to 15. Let me read it for you. Therefore, since the children share in the flesh and blood, the children are now us, right? He himself, Jesus, likewise also partook of the same, that through death he, Jesus, might render powerless him who had the power of death. That is the devil, in case you were wondering. And then verse 15, and might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. All their lives. Jesus says, I'm coming to take back power over the one who has the power of the death, who through his power of the death has kept us in fear of that death, and that fear puts us in slavery. Now the fear he's referring to is this word phobos, which, as you can imagine, is the root word for phobia, which means to withdraw, to separate from, to remove oneself, and hence to avoid because of dread. So the enemy, what is the enemy's mechanism? How does the enemy function with us? How does he manufacture this fear? You guys know the answer, come on. Deception. Isn't it so? He is a deceiver. And so through deception, he keeps us in fear of death. And because we are deceived into this fear of death, we choose to live our lives as slaves to that same fear. Fascinating. But then there's this other word, and this is important because we sometimes quote this verse, and the verse is from 2 Timothy 1 verse 7. Do you guys know it? For God has not given us a spirit of, but of power and a sound mind. Okay. So that fear, by the way, is a different word. Surprise, surprise. That fear is called dahlia, which means cowardice. Not phobia, not this kind of withdrawing. It's cowardice, which implies that we are not stepping up to the plate. We do not understand something about the power of this thing that we have. Are you with me? And so if we start to reframe our reality to say, what is it about fear that we need to understand, and why is it useful, and what is Christ's redeemed intent over this thing? Because if we can redeem our understanding about fear, perhaps then it becomes a tool that frees us. And so the enemy is here to create fear. A fear for the future, a fear for the unknown, a fear for failure. He is the one that deceives us into thinking that those things are real. And yet Christ comes into the conversation and he says, this thing that you think is the end, which is death, I'm going to pierce through it and show you that there is life on the other side. This death that you fear is a facade. It's not a reality. It's a deception. And he says, I'm the first in line among many brethren. I will show you the path. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And if you see through this veil that you think is the end, I will show you it's only the beginning. And so the power of death is made redundant. Isn't that incredible? And with that, the fear is made redundant. So let's dive into the other side. How do we harness this thing? We need to continue the conversation on 1 Timothy 2 verse 7, and something fascinating happens. I'm not going to put the slide up because you're going to read and you're not going to listen. It's coming. I'm upselling you on the future. Future is good. So the first two words, let's just talk about those first two words. The first one is, but I have not given you a spirit of fear, which is that timidity, but I have given you power, love, and a sound mind. Are you with me? Okay. That power, do you know the word he uses? He uses dunamis. It is literally the miracle working power of God. Isn't that incredible? So let me tell you, if you have been given the miracle working power of God, why are you then timid? Why are you cowardly in a situation if you have all the power of God? Because you are Christ in you, the hope of glory. Is that not so? Okay, so we have the power. Wonderful. What do we also have? The love. What is this love? Agape. It is the full expression of the love of God. We have that. We love because He first loved us. So why do we suffer from a fear of rejection? I cannot be rejected because I was first loved. Think about a marriage, right? When the husband and the wife stand there, I know in the American movies they do it differently because they want to. But everywhere else I've ever been at a wedding, who does the vows first? The husband. Why? You thought it was just tradition. Well, yes, but there's a reason for it. Why does the husband do the vows first? Because it means the husband faces the rejection. The wife can never be rejected because by the time she says her vows, she's already been loved. Jesus does the same thing for us. Because it is the husband's job to take the possibility of rejection off the table. Isn't that incredible? He first loved us. And so with those two things in mind, understanding that we have been given the power and the possibility of rejection has been eradicated from the realm of possibility, he introduces something fascinating. And it's a really long word, sophronismos. Now, what is fascinating about this word is, believe me or not, this is the only time, singular time in the Bible that this word is used. Go look it up in Strong's Concordance if you don't believe me. It is the only time that this Greek word is used in the Bible. And here's what it means. Properly safe-minded, issuing in prudent, sensible behavior that fits the situation. And I love this part. Aptly acting out God's will by what he calls sound reasoning. So sound mind doesn't mean you're smart and logical. No. It means that you are effecting the purposes of God. with His power and His love. Are you with me? And so why should I be timid if I have been called by the Father into a space to express the purposes of God? Why am I timid about that? I'm not here representing me. I'm here representing the King of Heaven on a mandate that He has given. Are you with me? That's what this is referring to. Now, if you have those three things, if you have been instructed, which means God is going to bring everything in heaven to bear on what you are doing because you are executing the purposes of God, should you have a fear of failure? No. If you have the agape love of Christ where He says, I'm going to take rejection off the table, should you have a fear of rejection? No. If you have been given a miracle working power so that you can accurately represent Christ, should you have a fear of the unknown? No, because you have everything you need. And so if those three things are true, do we then agree that every fear that we struggle with that undermines our decision making is a deception? I hope Jesus is opening the veil for you today. Because you have been kept in slavery by believing deceptions about things that you should be afraid of that have nothing to do with you. I want to challenge you for 5 minutes. Because you all have writing pads, right? So I've started doing something in my own personal time that I call truth journaling. So I coined the term, but you can call it whatever you want. It's just journaling for a particular purpose, right? And so what I do is I say, I want you to do this for the next 5 minutes. Write down the things right now that you fear the most. What is the thing right now that you are the most afraid of? Now I'm asking you to engage the fear. I realize that's going to be super uncomfortable, but do it now. And then when you're done doing that, I want to ask you, what are the chances that that thing is going to happen? And then I want to ask you a third question. What is Jesus' opinion and truth about that thing that you're writing on that paper? Let's take 5 minutes and do that. So what we've just done is I've forced you to go into system 2 thinking about something that you usually treat in your system 1 mind. And so I'm hoping that this gives you a tool to say, how do I deal with this deception? Because what we need to appreciate is what fear communicates to us is that there is a deception in our life that we need to take note of. Think of fear like a light on the dashboard of your car that says something is wrong with the engine. And whenever that fear comes up, because fear is not from God, and when that fear comes up, we have to say, I need to sit up and pay attention, because I have been confronted with something that is revealing a deception that I was not aware of. Are you with me? And so when we recognize this incredible kind of sense check that God built into our life to say fear is an incredibly powerful tool that highlights things that are keeping us in bondage. And if we can say this is valuable, let us harness this thing to say we shouldn't be afraid of it, because if fear is conquered by truth, are you with me? What is truth? Truth is a person. I am the way, the truth, and the life. And so Jesus' opinion, Jesus' word that He speaks over my life, that is truth. And this person loves me perfectly. And we see in 1 John 4:18, perfect love, the way that He loves me, casts out fear. The fear, by the way, in that verse is also the word phobos, actual fear. Perfect love casts out fear. And so when we position ourselves to say, Jesus, give me your perspective over fear, because fear is a consequence of deception. Fear in itself is not the point. Fear itself is not the problem. The problem is the deception that is triggering the fear. And so what we've done is we've made fear the culprit and we've made fear the enemy. Fear is just the messenger. And it is an incredibly powerful messenger, and it is an incredibly precious gift because it helps us to see the bigger issue, that we have let ourselves be deceived. And so I want to close with this. To be afraid, because fear and being afraid, by the way, are not the same thing. To be afraid means that I have accepted the fear as truth over my life. There's no biblical grounding for being afraid. Afraid is cowardice. Afraid is the timidity that Paul writes to Timothy about. To be afraid, to be in a position of powerlessness where I have no agency over my situation is the biggest deception of them all. Because God, the Creator God, spoke into the darkness and created the light. And yet, He made me in His image and in His likeness. Do I have the capacity to create? Yes. Do I have the capacity to make decisions? Yes. We are the only creature in all of creation that has the ability to envision a future that is different from today, because we have the ability to decide. And when we take that ability to see a different future and we mix it with the creative essence that God is in us, then we have the ability to craft a future that more accurately resembles the kingdom of God every single day. Why do we need to be afraid of it? The future can only be better because the increase of His government knows no end. Isn't that incredible? There is, honestly, nothing to be afraid of unless we are deceived. And so to be afraid is cowardice, but fear, when harnessed effectively, is power. Thank you very much.